Welcome back to another episode of A Mental Health Break with Vincent A. Lanci. I'm excited to launch another episode for you all. I'm Vincent Lanci, speaker and author of the book Left for Dead, A Story of Redemption. When I was 21 years old, I was the victim of a hit-and-run accident while walking home from a friend's birthday. After coming out of a coma and suffering from a traumatic brain injury, or you may know of as a TBI, I soon realized that it was time to put my mental health on a very high pedestal. This transformative experience has led me to create a podcast that is all things mental health. Would it benefit you to hear from mental health professionals and influencers? Would it also add value to your life to hear real life and authentic stories from people talking about their mental health, the issues they face, and how they actively combat them? If you answered yes to any of those questions, you came to the right place. I want to start by congratulating you for making your mental health a priority. If you missed the last episode, be sure to download it after you tune in today. For this episode, I am happy to introduce my guest, Dr. Doane. Providing individual therapy for adults in the Tampa Bay and Land O'Lakes area, Dr. Doane specializes in anxiety, panic, depression, low self-worth, sleep, and other related concerns. Dr. Doane holds a license as a psychologist in the state of Florida, and his previous clinical experience spans over a variety of settings that range from private practice, forensic assessment, university counseling centers, and residential inpatient. He's so diverse in his experience, so I had to have him on the show today. During his education, he received several merit-based awards, including Outstanding Doctoral Student, Outstanding Master's Student, and he's also been a mentor to many students across the country at the doctoral level, at WMU, UNC, USF. He's a true role model, but he's very, very passionate about mental health, so I'm very thrilled to have him on the show once again. Allow me to please introduce Dr. Doane. Brian, thank you for coming on my show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And to hear you say all that out loud feels kind of embarrassing, but that's cool.
Well, would you mind please introducing yourself a bit further to our listeners and share a bit of your story before we dive in and get going? And also please share your role relating to mental health.
Sure, yeah. So I am actually originally from Michigan, and I spent most of my life there, and went to grad school in Michigan, and actually earned a limited license both as a professional counselor and marriage and family therapist, and then decided to move to Florida, where, like you had said, I have opened up a private practice called Tampa Bay Counseling Services. And yeah, the focus of the practice is mainly helping people with anxiety. That's sort of the primary focus that I have, and also some folks who struggle with codependency and in general relationship concerns. But yeah, prior to that, spending a lot of time working in university counseling centers, which is a really wonderful experience too.
Well, we're glad to have you in Tampa. Where do you like living better?
Oh my gosh. So that's a good question. I like the summer in Michigan, which is great. But the good part of that summer lasts about 2 weeks. And so Florida has been, I think it's such a better fit for me and my family because we're really outdoorsy people, and the weather is amazing here, obviously. And the culture is different down here too. I think it's a little bit, um, you know, have you heard of the Midwestern bubble?
No.
So it's not true everywhere in the Midwest, but at least where I'm from, if you're standing closer than about 3 feet, then you've invaded my bubble. And so it's normal for people to be really like distant from each other, which might be good during COVID. But in the South, people are like a lot more friendly and they get closer to each other. And so at first it took some adjusting to, of like, why is this person in my space? But then you get used to it and it's like, this isn't so bad.
Yeah, I'm from New York, where especially if you go into the city, people are on top of you, very much so.
Yes, there's no bubble there, right?
Not much, but thank you for that introduction and thank you for sharing. On each episode, I share the mental health story of someone who is famous because I want to let you, the listeners, know you are not alone. I want you to understand that even though someone looks like they're healthy from the outside, they may not be on the inside too. I will now introduce the story of Trae Young when it comes to mental health. For those of you who don't know who Trae Young is, he's an NBA basketball player. This Atlanta Hawks guard uses his platform to speak on important aspects of life, including well being and mental health. This article is about 2 years old from when Young was a rookie, but it still had a ton of value in it. He was quoted saying, "I'm very aware of the mental health challenges ahead of me. I understand there will be a lot on my plate, like there has been for DeMar." DeMar is also an NBA player he's referring to, an NBA All-Star, in fact, who began speaking on challenges of depression a season before this article came out, and this brought a lot more attention to the ongoing discussion in the NBA for more a proactive stance on mental health and wellness. He was quoted saying, "I just go back to the hotel and relax, not even turn on the TV, because I know they will be talking about me. The criticism isn't going to help me. I've tuned out social media because that's a place that can really bring you down if you pay too close attention to what everyone is saying. So I don't." Fast forward to 2020, Trae Young is still doing big things, great things for the community. The NBA honored him with the January NBA Cares Community Assist Award for his efforts to impact the lives of youth, families, and those in need in Oklahoma and Georgia. The Trae Young Basketball Academy was established in 2019 with the focus of creating awareness for mental health and cyber and social bullying. It aims to positively impact both children and adults facing mental health difficulties through both research and education. Brian, what do you take away from this story and Trae Young's statements about mental health?
Man, I I think that what's really cool about this story is that everybody walks around with what we could call an inner critic, right? It's this voice we have in our head that its job is to say, are you sure you want to do that, or don't do that because that might be bad for these reasons, or whatever that is. But sometimes people's inner critic gets really nasty and can even be insidious, where it's just punishing to people, and even the volume in which that inner critic can speak to people can be incredibly overwhelming. And so when you're reading that, I was thinking about um, what it would be like. It's so hard to manage that inner critic without all this external input. And so what would it be like to walk around to where you're being talked about on television, or you're opening up Twitter and all these people have opinions about you, and some of those opinions are going to validate an unreasonable inner critic.
Mhm.
And so my reaction is, I'm glad I'm not famous. I don't really want to be famous, because that's a lot of extra work that I don't want to put into. But that it's hard enough for some people to manage the inner critic on their own. To have people who don't know you having opinions. It doesn't matter if they don't know you. If they're saying something that rings true for you, even if that thing that rings true isn't true, it can just feel so overwhelming, and hit that button inside of us that makes us just feel terrible. So I'm not surprised he's learned to tune it all out, because if it doesn't have value for him, good for him. And then to take that and say, I want to help other people, right? That to use that position and that platform to not just say social bullying or social media or bullying through social media is not a good thing, but for him to say, I went through that, and then to say, let's prevent kids from going through that too. Like, there's a vulnerability there that I think takes some courage to do that. And I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love your take on it. For everybody listening on, for people that may want to tune out the critics, tune out the things that they don't want to hear, what's some advice you can give them for that?
Oh man, that's a good question. Uh, I think the first thing that you have to do is start paying attention to what that critic is saying in a way that doesn't automatically assume that it is true. So what I tell a lot of people is, or part of the process for therapy is, if the first thing people notice is usually how they feel. Like, I don't feel good. I don't like, my heart is pounding, or I'm anxious, or I just want to leave the room. And I'm going to ask, usually, what was the thing that you just told yourself right before you started feeling that way? And usually what they'll say is something that is often an exaggerated form of what's really happening. So, uh, for example, like if somebody was, uh, let's say somebody is really nervous about driving in a car, so they don't like to drive in a car, right? Right before they get in the car, they're probably telling themselves, what if I get into an accident, or someone's probably going to tailgate me, or I'm, if the wind is blowing, the car is probably going to get blown off the bridge and I'm going to die. Well, there's grains of truth in what that person is saying, but my goodness, the way that you're making sense of it, that inner critic is out of control. And so we need to turn down the volume on how you're talking to yourself. And when you turn down the volume on that critic, the feelings tend to follow suit.
I think that's a great way to put it. Thank you for putting all that in there. I knew you'd give some value to our listeners. But Brian, it's time for the main event. On each episode, my guest and I will go over this series of 6 questions, which only slightly varies depending on if the guest is speaking on their own or others' mental health. By doing this, it allows me to deliver as much valuable to you, the listeners. So you ready to go, Brian?
Yeah, let's do this.
Great. So many would agree that the more common or talked about types of mental illnesses are mood disorders, anxiety disorders, or schizophrenia disorders. What areas do you come across the most?
Well, I would probably, of those 3, I certainly work a lot more with folks with anxiety. That is mainly because that's sort of how I advertise myself of that's my really focused area of expertise. So that's generally what I work with. Sort of as an interesting side note, in college counseling, if I remember right, that about 10 years ago, the primary presenting problem was depression. And within 10 years, that has flipped to the primary presenting problem is now anxiety, and the second most is depression. And so I think that, which would fall under a mood disorder, depression. And so, yeah, I think that those 2 really do tend to be really popular and the most common presenting concerns. But I tend to focus on anxiety, which, probably your listeners already know, but anxiety is like this big umbrella term for lots of subcategories of types of anxiety. And the main ones I will work with are people who struggle with generalized anxiety. So that means, they get anxious, not about any particular thing, but anxious about a lot of things a lot of the time. Or people with some kind of panic disorder. So they have, what that is you're having a fight or flight response, which is totally normal at an abnormal time. And so it's very disorienting and sometimes really scary. And then other types of anxiety that I work with are general phobias or even social phobia or social anxiety. And so an interesting little tidbit, social anxiety is the sort of the general sense that if you are going to meet people that you don't know or you don't know very well, if you don't have social anxiety, you're going to go and you might be a little uncomfortable because it's a new situation. But you're probably thinking, if I go talk to somebody, I'm going in a neutral way. I'm going to get to know them and I'll maybe like them a little bit, or I won't like parts of them, and it'll be reciprocal, but maybe we'll get along. Someone with a social phobia or social anxiety does not think that way at all. They are going to assume when I meet somebody new, they are automatically going to have judgments and criticisms about me. So they're thinking, if I was to meet somebody new, they're not going to like my shoes. They're going to think I'm boring. They're going to want to get away from me as soon as possible. And so, of course, what does that lead to? They don't want to go meet new people anymore because that's incredibly uncomfortable. I'll add a little bit more. So
Yeah,
the only other thing about that is with anxiety, rarely, well, most mental health issues, but rarely is it just one thing. That if somebody's anxious long enough, it's not uncommon for them to also start to get depressed. I wouldn't want to be anxious for a really long time because that sucks.
Yeah.
So after a while, it's kind of like, I don't really like how my life is going. And then, how do people cope with that anxiety? Sometimes it's people with really good intentions cope with it in really counterproductive ways. If we go back to social phobia, a really common way people cope is they start drinking. So if I'm going to go to this party where I don't know anybody, I'm going to drink alcohol, and it makes it easier. And, I don't have any judgments about that, but I would ask somebody, is that a long-term solution for you? And if it's not, then we probably have something to talk about.
Yeah, you mentioned how anxiety is kind of your niche, right? Your expertise area.
Yeah.
And you said there's a bunch of different types of anxieties. Is there any rhyme or rhythm to who's more prevalent to certain types of anxiety, gender, age? Describe that for us.
Yeah. So probably if we're looking for a commonality in people's likelihood of experiencing anxiety, the biggest one is probably your genetics. That research would say that's probably the strongest science we have as an indicator of whether or not you will struggle with anxiety. Now, second to that, are going to be previous experiences that you've had that may set you up to feel anxious. So people can certainly feel anxious because they're going through a crisis. You know, if you're in a terrible car accident, um, it would be pretty normal to feel anxious after that. But people can also have experiences, you know, like trauma. If you've had a traumatic experience, the likelihood of you having anxiety goes up, unfortunately. That's a part of that, unfortunately, a part of that experience. So there isn't certainly not a single thing we can point to, but you know, the more research that we do, the more we're learning of people's susceptibility or vulnerability to developing anxiety.
I love the depth of your answers. I could tell the passion behind what you're talking about, which is,
Yeah, I really am passionate about it.
yeah, which is exactly why I want to ask you, when did you first decide that a career relating to mental health was going to be the right career for you?
Yeah, um, I like this question too. So I was somebody who I liked a lot of different things when I was growing up. And when you like a lot of different things, it's really hard to pick a career because I could imagine myself doing a lot of things. Um, so actually, one of the first jobs I have in high school was I used to repossess cars, and so there's a lot of interesting experiences doing that. But what I learned through that job was what I learned was I don't want to do that. And that was part of my story in the beginning of my career is I did jobs that I realized I like this part of the job, but I don't want to do it because it's not fulfilling. So I did construction. I framed houses, and for a short period, I rebuilt semi-truck transmissions. And then I got a job working in a residential inpatient treatment facility, helping teenagers who struggled with substance use and severe and persistent mental illness. And that opened my eyes up to the helping profession. And I'm sure if you've had other therapists on here, I would imagine at some point, almost all of them have said, you know, I wanted to help people. And that if you're going to be a practicing clinician, that is definitely going to be a part of what makes you get up in the morning. And so at that experience at that inpatient treatment center, when I say it opened my eyes up, it opened my eyes up that these kids had, you know, I don't mean to be dramatic, but their life story is a horror story. They've had experiences that I think maybe some of the listeners don't even imagine can happen to people. I certainly didn't think that could happen. And so I developed so much empathy and understanding for why they would do what they did. You know, these kids, some of them were fairly, they would get angry and sometimes violent. And when you understand their story, their behavior makes a lot more sense. And that was like, that really helped me understand and have empathy for the suffering that they had. And they didn't choose that.
Right.
They didn't ask for any of that. And so I wanted to help them work through that. So that experience, I think, was a springboard for me to say, I want to do this, but I want to do it in a more professional capacity. And I want to work with people who, you know, I think what I learned was I loved helping, but I wanted to work with an older population.
Well, if you could help our listeners here, what are some potential early signs that they may be developing a mental illness? Can you help them recognize what those signs may be?
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. That so there's a lot of them, and each mental health issue is going to have different precursors to that development, or sometimes in some cases what we call prodromal features. What if I just spoke about anxiety? That might help narrow it down.
Let's do it.
So when people feel anxious, so I mentioned like fight or flight before, right? If you're going into fight or flight, if you see a bear in the woods, you're going to go into fight or flight probably. That would be a normal response. It's uncomfortable, but it makes sense. If you are going into fight or flight in a grocery store for no reason, then that is extremely uncomfortable. And your first reaction is, I'm going to do anything possible to make this feeling go away because I don't like it. And that's true for a lot of anxiety. It's not necessarily full-blown fight or flight, but when we get anxious, we can get little doses of adrenaline. We can get doses of the hormone cortisol that makes our body feel very uncomfortable. And so what I'm getting to is that one of the things that people will do to cope with that feeling is they're going to try to turn it off in some way. And that usually 9 times out of 10 means I'm going to avoid.
Right.
And so there's this strong pattern of avoidance. So if you are anxious about, if we go back to that social phobia, you're going to stop going to parties. You're going to stop meeting new people. And if that avoidance kicks in, you're going to probably start to feel lonely. And if that starts to impact you in any significant way, then we got to do something about that.
Absolutely.
But it could even be a little bit more nuanced, that some people are anxious around, let's say, conflict.
Okay.
And so they may say, they may talk about, it's so hard to say no to somebody, so I just say yes instead. Or I'm really angry at this person, but I just keep it to myself and I don't say anything. They are avoiding that conflict. And over time, that's going to really impact that relationship with that person, for both of them, for the worse in most cases. And so that avoidance, the more prevalent it is in your life, then I think that's a sign that somebody could say, maybe this, if it's impacting me in a negative way, what do I need to do to work on this?
All right, Brian, let's talk to the people who are ready to start making changes right now. If you could pick 3, and I say only 3 because I want the 3 most important things our listeners can do on a short-term or daily basis to start improving their mental health, what do you got for us?
I love your enthusiasm about this. This is great. So I bet lots of people have said some semblance of the 4 things I'm about to mention: eating, sleeping, spending time with people that care about you, and some form of exercise. Those are like the 4 pillars of, if you can get those things in order, you have decreased your vulnerability to mental health issues. It doesn't mean you're free from stress or even having a mental health concern, but you're in a much better place to deal with it. So let's count that as one. The other one I would mention is that I think a lot of mental health concerns tend to make life harder. Like, it's harder to get up in the morning if you're not feeling yourself. It is harder to raise your hand in a business meeting if you're feeling really anxious about it. And so what that tends to lead to is disorganization in some way. If you don't want to get out of bed, you're probably going to hit snooze. That means you might be late to work. If you don't raise your hand in the meeting, you're probably going to be annoyed that you didn't get that promotion. So it leads to disorganization. I would encourage people to start setting a schedule for how do they want their day to go. If you're going to be nervous about this meeting where you might have to contribute, then you probably want to set up a schedule to give yourself a little bit of boost before that meeting. Schedule an extra 5 minutes.
Love that,
to say,
yes.
I got this. I can do this. I'm smart. I've been in these meetings before. Even if I say something that doesn't go over well, it's not the end of the world. And so we can take that disorganization and add a little bit of structure to it. And I really like that too, because that's something that you're doing personally. And so when you do that, and if it has a positive impact, that can build your confidence and build your own self-autonomy, which is different than having a friend call you to make sure you get up in the morning.
Confidence is very key in almost everything you do in life. So that is great. And as far as you saying, you probably heard this before with other guests, people simplify it. And that's what I like most about having such qualified people on the show, is because when you simplify it and say, all right, am I eating right? Am I sleeping enough? Or am I doing the things that you need to do? But sometimes we all get so caught up in life and we start to slack in certain areas. So those are attainable short-term aspects, short-term goals for everybody to set. Let's look a little deeper here, Brian. What are some longer-term commitments our listeners can make to create a healthier mindset?
So one thing that I think people can go their whole lives and never take the time to sit down and do an honest assessment of who they are and what they're about. And what I mean by that is to take the time with a piece of paper. Don't do this in your head. Take the time with a piece of paper and write down, what do I like about myself? And if the answer is nothing, then we have a problem, because there are wonderful qualities about you. You just don't see it yet. And so if that's a tough question to answer, then I might ask myself, okay, so what would my best friends say that they really appreciate about me? and write that down. And do it in an honest way. That the word, it's not an assessment, it's an honest assessment that we're not trying to hide. It's just you and this piece of paper. So there's no reason to fudge an answer. And then on the other side, it's what don't I like about myself? And don't let that inner critic run wild. Hold it in check. You know, that if you are socially awkward, don't say that you're the most awkward person in the world, because that's not true. And then if you have an honest assessment of like what you're about, then you can ask yourself the question of, how do I want my life to be different? And I think a lot of people would say, well, like, I want to be happier, right? Well, that's a wonderful goal. I want to be happier too, but it's not concrete enough. I don't know what to do with that. So if you were happier, how would you know? What if a question sometimes we ask in therapy is, if I could wave this magic wand and all of a sudden you were happier, but you didn't know that I did it, how would your life be different? How would you know that you were happier? And now you've got some concrete, actionable steps to take about what you want your life to be different. Because if you're trying to fix your life without having that honest assessment first, then you're building a plan on something that may not solve the problem.
I think it all stems back to confidence again, which is seeming to be the good theme of your episodes, having the confidence in whatever area you choose to go down. But we all see the passion you've had throughout this episode. What are some ways you plan on raising awareness for the importance of mental health in the future?
Does this podcast count?
Of course.
Yeah. You know, so I'm going to tie it back to something I said earlier. When I was talking about working at the residential inpatient facility, one thing that became glaringly apparent is that I mean, we all know this, but to see it in real life, I think hit home for me in my early 20s, that we all come from different places and definitely socioeconomic statuses. And there is certainly a stigma around therapy and counseling, not the least of which is perpetuated by the fact that our profession is grounded in confidentiality and secrecy. So we don't go around talking about what we talked about with somebody.
Yep.
And so generally people get a sense for therapy that maybe they had a friend that went through it, but probably more likely it's, I saw a therapist on TV. And, you know, therapy, unfortunately, as a television show would be kind of boring. So it gets sensationalized. And these dramatic things happen. And I think people are left to their own assumptions and own opinions about what therapy is. And sometimes that's where the stigma can exist, among other reasons. And I think socioeconomic status perpetuates that even further, because if you can't afford counseling, or you don't know people that can afford counseling, then you have even less of a frame of reference of how it could potentially be helpful or productive. Or potentially you have an identity in which bigger systems in place, or the healthcare profession in general, has perpetuated violence against you, historically, whether it's going generations back for your family. So there's lots of good reasons why people don't go to therapy. So all that to say, one thing that I really try to do is break down that stigma, is give people a really good, healthy experience in therapy. And for the people that can't access it, I do have a number of spaces available where I see people for free, or I see people at a extremely reduced rate, because I know that they may never otherwise be able to access help, or this kind of help. And if they can have a good experience, then it would be my hope that they could tell other people to say, you know what, therapy is not that scary. Therapy is not the worst thing in the world, and it actually helped me. That, I think, in addition to things that we can do at a broader, more systemic scale, certainly are helpful. But it's that personal experience of your best friend saying, I went to therapy, they helped me with anxiety, and now I'm less anxious. That's a big deal.
I love it, Brian. Thank you so much. I know our listeners are going to see all the value in your episode today. I love when you talked about why you chose the career related to mental health. I could feel the passion driving from that. I also liked when we talked about the short-term solutions and long-term setting a schedule. I think that's very important. It's something I adopt every day before I go to bed. I write down the 3 most important tasks I have for before I wake up. I do it again after I nap. It's something where that's really worked for me. And I also liked how you acknowledged how we are from different places, we are from different backgrounds, but if we take the right steps, we can all accomplish the same end goal in creating a more positive mental health. But it's time for the last word. And I do this on my other podcast series, What It's Really Like to Be an Entrepreneur, too, because I want our listeners to really get to know my guests. Is there something that you would like to share with everybody listening on that we did not get to touch on yet today?
Maybe just to continue off what I was saying around that stigma. And, maybe it's helpful. Let me back up. So I think some of the biggest barriers to people seeking out counseling is not just making that first phone call, but it's the idea of what is that first session like? And so I just want to take like 30 seconds to talk about what that first session would be like with me, which I think is some general representation of what it would be like with most therapists.
Yeah. Well, I also want to backtrack you to before we were talking about how you do some sessions, maybe pro bono or at a discounted rate for those that can't afford the service.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great time to introduce your website, your contact information for even regular bookings, or any ways for our listeners to follow this endeavors that you're on in breaking down these stigmas.
Yeah. So if people want to reach out to me, my website is www.tampabaycounselingservices.com. Just go to my website. It has all my contact information. It's an easy way to access that. But even so, I even have a link in there under my frequently asked questions, and under that is my what you can expect in the first session. And I think it's just helpful that people have assumptions like, am I going to lay down on a couch? Am I going to have to sit there and talk nonstop the whole hour? No. In general, that's not what therapy is. Some people do that, but for the most part, that's sort of an outdated approach, or most people don't do that. If you were to come and meet with me, I'm going to explain the course of therapy. I'm going to answer any questions that you may have. And then I'm going to say something along the lines of, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions today. And some of them are going to be pretty easy and straightforward. But some of the questions I'm going to ask might feel really personal. And so if we start to venture into something that you're not comfortable talking about with me today, just let me know and we can move on to something else. I don't want you to have to talk about anything that you're not comfortable with, and you're in charge of where we go and where we don't go today. And I think it's important that people hear that I'm not prying into your life. I just am creating space for you to talk about what you need to talk about. And if you want to save something for later or not at all, it's perfectly fine.
I think that's very nice of you to offer that information. So everybody be sure to check out that website, social media, all the stuff to stay on top of what he's offering. And be sure to check out the show on whichever platform you like to use. We're at a Mental Health Break on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. And Twitter, we're Podcasts by Lanci, so you get updates from both of my shows. Of course, my handles are at Vincent A. Lanci on all social media and YouTube. And my website is vincentalanci.com. If you check out my books, DM me. I want to hear from you. I have Left for Dead, A Story of Redemption, and How to Transform Your Mindset When the Norm is Changed for all of us dealing in quarantine like right now. Both are on Amazon. Let me know. If you enjoyed today's episode, please continue listening and rate A Mental Health Break with Vincent A. Lanci 5 stars. I work hard to find value delivering guests for you on each episode. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you all on the next episode of A Mental Health Break with Vincent A. Lanci.